Wow, what a professional ad we just got there. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to TBRCon2023. This is the Bending and Breaking Genre Conventions panel, sponsored by The Broken Binding. I'm your host, Alina Boyden, and before we get started, I'd just like to thank Adrian Gibson of SFFaddicts podcast and Tyra Lien of FanFiAddict for hosting and organizing this event. We appreciate all the hard work they've put in and want to thank them so much for that. And now on to our lovely panel here. We have some great authors to talk about bending and breaking genre conventions. And I'd like to start with introductions. I think that's probably the best place to start. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go clockwise from where I'm seeing things on the screen. So it's going to go to Dan, and then Tade, and then Chris, and then Chana, and then Vaishnavi. So let's start with Dan. If you'd introduce yourself and please introduce your books as well. And if you have one that's most recent that you'd like to highlight, please go ahead and add that too.
Hi, I'm Dan Fitzgerald. I write fantasy and romantic fantasy and fantasy romance. I have the Maer Cycle trilogy, which is kind of fantasy, the Weirdwater Confluence duology, which is romantic fantasy, and upcoming Time Before trilogy, which is somewhere in between romantic fantasy and fantasy romance. The book you see behind me, The Delve, comes out on Wednesday.
Awesome. Tade, how about you?
Hi, I'm the author of Rosewater and Rosewater, the 3 Rosewater books, which are science fiction, and I wrote the Molly Southbourne books, which are sort of horror, but also horror, espionage, that sort of thing. I've written crime, which is Making Wolf. I've written another book called Jackdaw, which is horror. And I've written Far From the Light of Heaven, which is probably the closest to traditional science fiction that I've ever written. I've also written fantasy short stories. My latest short story will come out in March, called The Sweet and the Empty, which is a fantasy short set in the 6th century. So yes.
6th century, that's exciting. I like that. Love history. Chris, how about you?
Hi, I do short fiction and novels. I have 2 novels out that I don't carry around with me. So there they are. One is they're both sci-fi. This one is a comedic space opera that's kind of, I don't know, got a lot of potty humor in it. And this one is this is called Stringers. And this is called The Phlebotomist, and it is a near-future sci-fi where society is segregated by blood type. And I have a horror novel coming out next year called The Redemption of Morgan Bright, and they're all from Angry Robot. So anyway, that's me. I kind of write whatever. If I have an idea I like and it sticks with me, that's kind of what I write.
Awesome. That's
The Phlebotomist is great. Just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be excited to read it. I have to check it out, even though the title kind of makes me a little bit shy because I have like vagal syncope, so I pass out at the Phlebotomist if I'm not careful. So
there is blood in it.
Oh well. And Chana, what about you?
Hi. So I'm Chana Porter. My debut came out spring 2020. Was anything happening then that you guys can rack your brains about? So I wrote a book called The Seep, and that came out from Soho Press. That was about a benevolent alien invasion. And my next book comes out from Saga this spring. It's called The Thick and the Lean, and that is about a culture where sexual pleasure is very public, but food pleasure is highly taboo.
Oh, cool.
That's
And
really
I write libretto and plays as well. I came from novels as a playwright.
Oh, that's really exciting. Do you have any librettos you want to highlight?
I'm writing a libretto for Le Guin's The Dispossessed. So that's kind of my my dream coming true. It's good. It's good.
I actually would love to pick your brain about that on maybe a different panel or a different time, because I love opera, but I don't know anything about it or how it's written. So I think that's fascinating.
Love to talk.
So
yeah,
that's cool.
And I just want to say I'm a person who stutters too. So should you hear me stutter, it's not a audio problem.
Cool. Well, thanks for that heads up.
Sure.
Awesome. And I also debuted in May of 2020. So I share your pain. I know what that's like. It was brutal.
Yeah.
But that's right. So Vaishnavi, how about you?
Hi, I'm Vaishnavi Patel. My pronouns are she, her. My debut novel, Kaikeyi, came out in spring 2022, so just last year. And that was a myth retelling that was somewhere in between historical fiction and fantasy, not quite comfortably in either. And that's all I have out right now. My second book, which is another similar myth retelling, will be coming out in spring 2024.
Awesome. We're excited to have you. My friends have been raving about that book. So yeah, great. So we're here to talk about bending and breaking genre conventions. And so I think, like any good academic, I want to start us off with a definition. And so we're going to go around again and just see, like, when somebody says genre convention, what does that mean for you? Because I think sometimes when we talk about things like genre conventions or even tropes, which may or may not be two different things, they provoke a lot of strong emotions, but they also maybe people might be coming at it from different angles. So Dan, what does it mean when I say genre convention to you?
To me, when I'm thinking of genre conventions, it's the people who did it first, or the people who popularized it first. So in fantasy, there's, you have Tolkien as one of the, giants there, and a lot of the things that he wrote kind of defined what the genre was going forward. In romantasy, there's a lot of people you could say, but I think, Sarah J. Maas is a huge imposing figure, even though she's still writing and fairly recently begun. But these are the people that sort of change and define the genre and draw readers. And so whenever you're writing in a genre, you have to be aware who are the giants in this genre, and how does my work relate to them, and how do I bounce it off and, do something different, but also stay within something that's going to be recognizable, because ultimately readers are looking for a book where they can read the blurb and say, oh, this is a book I would like or not. So you have to be aware of that when you're writing. So anyway, that's what it means to me.
That's awesome. And romantasy is, I've never heard that before, which maybe is a bad reflection on me, but that's a cool portmanteau. I like it.
Well, it's because fantasy romance and romantic fantasy are a little bit different, but those of us who write it kind of, scoop it together in one big bucket sometimes.
Fair, yeah. Tade, what about you?
So to me, it kind of goes a little bit. Okay, so there's something that that Robert McKee says in Story. He says that the audience knows the rules, even if they don't know they are the rules. So genre conventions to me are those aspects of a particular story tradition that the fans and writers of that tradition recognize. Their category ticks, their category behaviors within fiction that is classified of that kind. And it's not just there for classification purposes. If such a thing is there, if there's there are genre conventions you can break, but you have to be aware of them before breaking them, and you have to let the reader know that you're aware of them, because if you don't, there will be a loss of satisfaction at the end of the narrative. So if you have what is supposed to be, say, crime fiction, and then you have a body in the beginning, there is an expectation that the cause of death will be solved by the end of the novel. And if you don't do that, it will cause some pause in the reader. It may affect the satisfaction of the reader. Now, it may be that you just want to write a reflective piece on the nature of grief, and the solving of the murder is, incidental. But you have to kind of signal that in the beginning of your narrative, so that it's not that the reader doesn't think, well, actually, you don't know how to write a murder mystery. You have to say, okay, I know. You have to then signal, I know this is a dead body. I know that you would normally expect that, but that's not what this narrative is about. And then we can, the reader can then go along with you and say, okay, maybe this is a different kind. So they will forgive a lot of things. But for category purposes, for recognition purposes, those, that's what conventions are.
Yeah, that's an awesome definition. I appreciate that. And we've lost the cat, so we can't recognize the cat. But there was a cat. That's too bad. Chris, why don't you go ahead and let us know what you think?
I mean, from my perspective, I think that just going off of what Dan and Tade said, it's a lot about expectations. So it's your reader expectations for the most part is I think why we even have genre. Otherwise, if we didn't have readers, people would just write what they wanted and put it out and not even, need to categorize it. So I think it's a lot about expectations. I was having this conversation yesterday with another writer, Gabriella Houston, who is working on a romance novel, her first romance novel, and she's written fantasy before that. And we had this exact conversation. She's like, there's certain things I have to tick off that are expected in this. And I was saying, yeah, I'm writing my first horror novel right now, and there's certain things that are expected there, but I believe that the lane, so to speak, for romance is narrower in the sense that there are really, really important things that you've got to have. Whereas horror, it's maybe a little bit not as defined. There's some fear, there's some horror, whatever that is. But I really think it's expectations. If you say this is a blank book, this is whatever this is, and it turns out to be a little bit different, you might have upset or disappointed readers, which I have experience with. My book Stringers is a humorous sci-fi book. I'm very proud of it. It got a starred review from Publishers Weekly. They compared it to Hitchhiker's Guide, and that turned out to be probably the worst thing that could have happened to me, because I got a lot of readers who are like, great, Hitchhiker's Guide. I mean, that's the book in funny space stuff. My book is not Hitchhiker's Guide at all. It is a humorous book that takes place in space. And in that respect, they're similar, but it kind of got set off on this. It's a blessing and a curse. But if you misstate the expectations, then you can do a lot of damage to yourself and upset readers.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. I want to ask you too, just as a follow-up. Do you think that's more of a marketing problem, or do you think it's like genuinely a reader's problem?
I don't think the readers are the cause of it. I think it's a marketing issue. I mean, I've become, I'm a relatively new author. My debut was 2020. And so, we didn't have any big marketing or categorization sort of missteps that I felt with the first one. It was the second one that there aren't a whole lot of space operas that are really, really focused on humor. Most people could probably just list a handful. So the first one people go to is Hitchhiker's Guide. And I think we could have done a better job of sort of just from the copy, on the back, even just saying that, this is a funny book, but it's less absurdist. It's, it has a lot of actually hard sci-fi in it. And so we had people reading it for the humor, and then they complained about the hard sci-fi. It crosses some stuff, so it's partially my fault too. There's some answers that marketing wasn't ever going to be able to solve. I wrote a story that does several things. It literally blended a few things. So it was, it's not high concept. That's something I've recently learned, is this was hard to describe. Tried to describe Ambergris by Jeff Vandermeer. Some books you can't. They're great books, but you can't describe them. High concept is easy to describe, easy to communicate. I didn't write that book.
Yeah, fair. That makes sense. Hannah, do you have any thoughts on genre conventions and what it means to have a genre convention?
Yeah. Well, in the frame of my first book, the Seep, when I started talking about that, I started saying things like, imagine if, the 1970s film Invasion of the Body Snatchers wasn't bad. And that gives people kind of something to sink their into. But in terms of reader expectation, when you have a story about beings from another place, some people are going to come to that thinking that you're going to find out where they come from and if they what sort of technology they have. And my novel is really a book about grief and about what it means to be a person as humanity changes. And I did not get into that stuff at all. So I think, I don't know, thinking about what Chris just said, I feel like it's painful sometimes, but a really good opportunity just for you to find what your readership is. Comparing something to a more famous thing as a marketing tool is a important shorthand that hopefully then we can discard. My new book is being compared to The Handmaid's Tale. It's not really like The Handmaid's Tale, but I understand why we're pointing toward it. Hopefully it will attract enough of people that like it for itself, and we won't have to hold up these other things to it. But I think just in terms of a really quick way to identify a little bit about what we're standing on the shoulders of, I think it's helpful, and then we can discard. That's kind of why I like comparing something to a movie sometimes. The feeling and the color palette. I set my book in San Francisco too, as a very much nod to Body Snatchers. And I liked the idea of a horror being turned on its head. Yeah, but that can't take you past the first couple of pages. People will pick it up and clearly know that it's not that. I feel like comparing books to other books is a little bit trickier.
Yeah, that makes sense. I agree with you, especially since writing styles can be so wildly variable, and fans can be very particular as well. Vaishnavi, do you have a definition for genre conventions for us?
I don't think I can say anything better than what before me have said. But I think I sort of have two thoughts to add potentially. One of which is that when I think of genre, because I'm writing in the myth space, genre goes and expectations for what it's supposed to be go all the way back to the epics, right? This hero's journey structure, Odyssey, Iliad, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Beowulf, Gilgamesh, they all followed somewhat similar structures, similar themes in many ways. And so when you say that you're doing a myth retelling, people expect that certain of those elements are going to be carried over, and that you're going to have certain heroes, certain villains, certain ways of talking about or viewing the world that you're carrying with you. And if you choose to deviate from that, then readers expect an explanation, I've found, either in the text of the book, or if you don't believe in giving your readers explanations in the book, then they will ask you about it outside of the page. But I also think that when I was writing Kaikeyi, this was before myth retelling had sort of become a genre of its own. And now I sort of hear people talking about myth retelling as a genre. at the time I was drafting, like Circe had come out and I hadn't read it, and that was about it. And since then, there have been like, I don't know, 60 or 70 books that have come out in the past 4 or 5 years that are retelling primarily Western myths, primarily written by white authors. And so I think a really interesting part of like what is genre convention, what is genre expectation, has been navigating expectations that are being set by white and Western stories. And then you're coming in with like this is a story from 3000 BCE India, and like everything that comes with that, and people having an expectation that was set by like familiar Greek or Norse or various British mythologies, and not getting that. And so I think there's something to be said about genre conventions being bound up in like certain cultural traditions that I think slowly get broken over time. I mean, I primarily read like authors of color and fantasy now, and it's fabulous. But I will say that like that seems to be what gets set first. And then if you are writing something different, then sometimes it's viewed as breaking the convention, even if, you know, you're retelling a 5,000-year-old story.
Yeah, I know in my second book, my South Asian audience understood that I was playing with a Bollywood trope, and none of the white people who read it did. And I was like, oh, do you find that your audience splits itself in that way, where you have very different reactions from different communities?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts, right? Like there's some Indian readers who are very mad that I have changed or critiqued some parts of our mythology. And then there's some who are like getting it and very excited to see themselves represented. And then on the other side, there's readers who are not familiar, but are excited to read about a different culture or learn about it, and are, you know, willing to like Google the story and read the Wikipedia page, which truly is all you need to do. And then there's always going to be people who are mad that it wasn't like spoon-fed to them, or that you're writing from a different cultural context. And I think, you know, part of what makes, at least in the myth retelling genre, I think what makes myth retelling so popular is people have learned these stories either through like Percy Jackson or reading the Odyssey or whatever it might be. And if they haven't, they at least feel like they've heard the names before, or there's some familiarity. And I think that when that familiarity isn't there, it can be a bit of a struggle.
That makes sense. Yeah, especially it's hard without a common cultural background or a common sort of I guess like language of scholarship or language of literature, it can be difficult to even play with tropes and conventions, because your audience doesn't know the first convention to begin with, so they don't really see what you did with what you're playing with. So on that note, I'm going to do this as a fave least fave thing in the interest of time. I was going to break it up, but I think we'll do both together. So Dan, could you give me your absolute like favorite genre convention, was one that you like and that you don't really want to subvert, that you have fun with and that you think is great, and one that you absolutely like wish would go away and that you don't ever want to see again and that you hate, without naming names? But you know, just let us have it. Let us have the real opinion.
Well, see, now I'm going to piss off some authors, I'm sure. So the thing that I love the most in a romantasy is, and part of the reason I like fantasy romances, I like my romances where people are just really gone for each other, and I love it. I really want them to get together by the 50% mark, and then I want fantasy shenanigans to make it harder, but they'll stick together until the end. Like that's kind of my prototypical, what I love to see. And I've really struggled. I'm not going to use the word hate, but I really struggle with extreme slow burns. I've read some slow burn fantasy romances that I absolutely adored, but like starting around like 50% mark, I'm getting antsy. I'm like, come on. We know this is going to happen. Why are you going to make me wait till the very last chapter? And that is a personal preference. But I very strongly feel like if it's for me, for a romance, like I want it steamy and I want to get there by, 50, 60%. But I know some people who absolutely adore slow burn. So I would never use the word hate. And some of my best reads of the last year were slow burns. And a side note related to the slow burn, my other thing that bothers me, I won't say I hate it, but I want the last sex scene in a romance to be hot. Sometimes you have like the big bang, so to speak, at like, 75, 80% or whatever. And you have like another one at the very end. And sometimes that last one is just kind of like, and they got together and they kissed and that's it. Like I want final smut. And I feel very strongly about that.
Final smut. Oh no, all my fantasy romances are going to disappoint you terribly. They too much of like the Bollywood influence, where it's like they start to kiss and then the flower shows up and the scene moves on. So
I mean, that's fine. Like if a romance sets the expectation that it's not spicy, that's perfectly fine. But I mean, if you're going to give me smut at 50%, I want a little bit more smut at 96%. That's all.
All right, that's turn the smut meter up. All right, which is a genre convention I guess we could all stand to live by. So, thank you for that. Tade, how about you? Love and hate, or love and maybe don't love as much?
Okay, so for love, I'm going to go with the revelation of the monster in a horror narrative. And the monster could be an actual monster, could be a human being, it could be a situation, it could be anything. But when skillfully done, it's brilliant. But it is also the point at which less skillful writers fail, because this is the point at which you have to your horror, this is where you reveal what has been causing everything, so we're looking at, to go with what Dan said, we're looking at the last 25% of the narrative here. We're looking at, this is when you see the actual monster, and if you don't do it right, is that what Stephen King says? This is where you see that, oh, it's just a guy in a rubber suit, like you have to reveal your horror, and your horror has to be sufficiently horrific. If it's been written well, then you will feel that revulsion and fear and all of that. If it's not been written well, you'll laugh, because the feeling of terror is just literally on a knife edge, and you could fall into laughing afterwards, because you need a nervous laughter to get over all the tension that's been building up. So it's a very fun, and I love when it's done very well. I love it when it's done well. When it's not done well, it's a disaster. Yeah, so so there's that. I'm not going to talk about examples of that. One that I don't like is the serial killer trope in crime fiction, particularly when it's like, oh yes, this person is a psychopath and all of that, and all of them have read Hare's psychopath checklist, and they're all writing all of that in there. First of all, there are not that many psychopaths anyway. Second of all, the idea of a psychopath is not actually universally accepted anyway. Hare's checklist has so many problems with it. But if we had this many psychopath killers, we would all be dead by now. Like, there are just too many of them, and it is so uninteresting to me now that, yes, okay, yeah, used to kill animals when was a child, is emotionless but has superficial charm. I'm tired of that nonsense. Give me more interesting criminals to commit the crimes. There is a vast array of people that commit crimes. They don't all have mental illnesses. They don't all have personality disorders. Some of them are just like everybody else. All right. And lots of people get away with crimes because of that. Because, I'm sorry, there aren't any markers. It's just a person who decided, you know what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to plan it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to get away with it. So that really is a trope that I would really rather died very hard, a very painful death. I would like it eradicated, and let's just have more interesting criminals. But as a side note, also in crime, the killing of young women, I get it. I know why it's done, but can we have more victims, more different victims, please? Like, there's an article I read once about how the showing of murdered women is almost ritualistic in books and in films and all of that. It's almost ritualistic. It's almost like, yes, you have to show the dead woman and all of that. Sometimes you show the killing of the woman, sometimes not, but you have to show the corpse itself and everything. And it's, laid out there with echoes of Ophelia, it's another trope that I'm tired of, basically. So, but yeah,
I think those are great, especially since we know that the preferred pornography of actual serial killers was the detective magazines of the women bound up and murdered, and it's like, okay, so what are we doing when we're doing those things?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a wonderful point. Awesome. Well, thanks for those. Chris, what have you got for us? I know you were feverishly thinking of some. So how'd we do?
Well, I've got some, but I just want to say about what Tade said about the monster reveal in horror. The thing I like about horror is horror is very forgiving if you don't explain everything exactly, right? Because I think if you do, if you explain it down to every nut and bolt, the horror's all gone. Even if it's a really, really terrible thing that is the monster, whatever that is. If you explain it down to every detail, the mystery is gone, the wonder is gone, the horror is gone. And horror is very forgiving of, wow, I just read this book and I don't know exactly what happened. I can't necessarily explain it, but I feel like the author understood. And if I feel like the author was in control, and if I feel like the author knows the answer, I'm okay if I don't. As far as love and hate, you see this a lot, obviously, in dystopian, sort of your run-of-the-mill dystopian stories, and you see it in some fantasy. The thing I hate the most is the automatic badass. Just the person who just, can whatever, is just awesome, is basically a ninja kind of out of nowhere. And I kind of also tie that into the training montage. I just don't think that all of your vital skills for fighting the bad guys can be learned through a training montage. So I'm sort of anti-training montages and automatic badassery. In my book, The Phlebotomist, the main character is a 67-year-old grandma, and her special weapon is experience. So anyway, and then as far as love, the thing I love most, and generally this could be sci-fi, fantasy, horror, is a really inventive big bad that is amoral. I really, really like amoral actors, or morally gray actors, or even non-sentient actors that are the big bad. And a great example of that is from The Expanse, the proto-molecule that they have in The Expanse, which is just a tool. But this tool is designed to basically use whatever it finds to build something for the people that made it. And you don't even meet those people. You don't even meet those creatures, people, aliens, whatever they are. You just know their tool. And that to me is almost more terrifying than someone who has an ethos in what they do, because this thing is coming and you can't reason with it. You can't argue with it. And so I like really creative big bads, and I really like well done, morally gray actors that could be they could be a protagonist or they could be an antagonist. Most often an antagonist. But that's my love and hate.
That's awesome. I love that. And I love that you chose a 67-year-old grandma as well. I feel like the older I get, the cooler I get. And that's certainly not always the case in fantasy. Like, you very rarely get to see, especially in fantasy, older characters. So I think that's really interesting. So, yeah. Hannah, what have you got for us?
I am thinking a lot about, so some things that I love like a space station horror tropey thing. Particularly when it leans into surreal elements, things that kind of blend into, like, there's a dark poetry of the space. We don't know why these things are happening. I'm thinking about things like Solaris, and most things that I feel bothered by, if that nut can be cracked and it can be done, like Dan said, in a way that I really love, I'm totally fine for all these things that I have pet peeves about to be poked and flipped. And I think that can be some of the most satisfying things. I'm thinking, I get irritated by the friends into lovers trope. I get irritated by very clear, like, this person is actually a different person, and that flip will come at some point in time. But those things being done well, I can really love, and I do use them sometime, because I feel like when you have a pet peeve about something, it can mean that there's kind of good juice there for you to explore. so this is kind of like a love-hate when it's done well and when it's not. If there's a horror, especially let's say in space, a horror trope happening, if the whole team does everything spot on and they're really smart and things still go very bad, I am much more drawn to that than watching people be bad at their jobs. I really hate reading or watching people be bad at their jobs. Like how did you get that job? Seems hard. Why are you so bad at it?
Where they're like chopping the cake wrong, and you're like, can't watch it.
It's an idiot book.
Yeah. Don't go into the fucking basement, okay? Why are you bad at this? Be good at it and then still have bad things. Ooh, that's much scarier, in my point of view.
No, I think you're right, and I think actually that's like the rule in that classic book writing to sell is your hero or heroine has to continually fail through no fault of their own. And I think like that's something I always have to remind myself too, because nobody wants to read somebody who is miserable at their job, who you read them and you're like, this person would never be in this position in their lives. There's just no way. They have no idea what they're doing. So yeah, I find that frustrating as well.
To Chris's point, they can't be automatically great at everything because then there's no stakes.
Yeah, exactly. And if they're automatically good at everything, there's no relationship with the audience either. There's no struggle. So also, I love that you said that, yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering but these aren't tropes, so these are markers of bad writing. It's true. These are markers of bad writing. They're not particular genre tropes.
Unless it happens enough.
Yeah, well, I don't know, because like the chosen one genre convention of high fantasy kind of, to me, you can always say, well, if you did it right, it wouldn't have those things. And I think that's true. Maybe I've just seen too many that have done it wrong, and maybe that's on me. But I feel like in certain cases you find that that like those particular genre conventions do oftentimes lead to I guess maybe a kind of, I think you're right. Maybe it's just bad writing because it's a kind of predictability, and you could subvert that probably, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So so I'm excited for that. But first, Vaishnavi, love and hate. What have you got for us? I love what Chana said, that hate is sometimes writing juice. It's grist for the mill. So and I think that might be true of you and what you wrote as well. So.
Yeah, I think I have like my love and hates are both sort of like, I really like it when it's done well and I really hate it when it's done badly. Which is to say, so like in this retelling or even just historical fiction space more generally, I really love to see stories where like groups that were historically not given a voice get a voice, but I find like I only like it if it's done in a way that's like interesting and potentially subverting the original story or what you originally thought of the story. I get really frustrated when it's just like we're getting the inner dialogue of the person, but like nothing different is happening. There's no new insights. I just find it very passive, and while I think there's maybe some value into like having a thought exercise, I think that these groups were actually, like, if we're talking about like women or like lower caste people in India or people of color, like they weren't just passive actors the way that they were written in other people's stories. Like they were active and affecting things and having their own goals and accomplishing them. And so I get a little like, I really love to see it done well. And I really don't like to see it when it's like, in just sort of passive or just sort of an internal narration with like nothing different. And then on the flip side, something that I like usually get really annoyed about is if, I think this is a common trend where it's like, you're getting the story of a woman who is like oppressed for whatever reason or like struggling against her society. And maybe she accomplishes something, but at the end, her happy ending is a husband and or children. And that like really I love romance. Like I'm not bothered by that in romance because that's like the point. Although I do, prefer it when there's like also some other goals that are accomplished or like character growth that happens. But in fantasy or in myth retelling, where the end point they're like happily ever after is, well, they finally found the one man that doesn't abuse them, or they like finally got to have a kid and suddenly their life has like meaning when it never had meaning before. I'm really bothered by that. But on the flip side, I do enjoy it where like I don't want it to just be suffering. Like I want there to be some happy ending or some hopeful ending. I prefer for that to be like independent of acquiring another family member, because I just think that like narrows their place in the world and in the story again from whatever it had been previously expanded to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. That's a yeah. I've seen that done well, and I've seen that done badly. So I'll leave it there. I think probably because yeah, I agree with that completely. Okay, so let's move to a little bit more specifics here. And I want you all to pick one of your books. It may be your only book right now. It may be one of your many books. It may be even one of your short stories. And I want you to pick one that that bent or broke genre conventions. And what we're going to do is we're going to delve a little bit deeper into that. So let's start delving with Dan. And Dan, do you have a book that set out to break any genre conventions? And if so, what book and which ones?
I guess I have to talk about the delve, because I love fantasy and I love super smutty romance, and I really want super smutty fantasy romance where the fantasy is like full strength and the smut is full strength. And obviously that's not something you find enough of for my taste, I guess. I don't know if I set out specifically to break, but like that was kind of part of the inspiration behind this book, because when this has been talked about many times, but it's perfectly fine in a fantasy for people to be eviscerated and beheaded and tortured and all sorts of horrific things to be done to them in great detail. But when it comes to, people having sensual sex in equivalent detail, oftentimes that's frowned upon. And I love those things in my book. So I was like, I want to write a fantasy that has all of it. So it's got like bloody battle scenes. It's got super intimate and emotionally, charged sex scenes. And I also wanted it to be, fantasy tends to run really long. And I tend to prefer when things are sort of short and tight. So this is like a dungeon crawl in a way. So there's a simple scenario. The whole thing takes place in a mine, and you're in and out in 275 pages. But lots of blood, lots of smut, all of it mixed in together. And of course, it's romance, and that's kind of the challenge. It's romantic fantasy with some romance arcs in it, but that's the larger sort of idea behind the delve.
That's really exciting. 275 pages of pure blood and smut sounds
275 pages, but
yeah,
still,
200.
Still not much.
Yeah. No, that's really exciting. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting take on things, especially since I agree with you. Like when I published Stealing Thunder, originally it had like YA crossover appeal, but all the YA publishers were like, the main character is a sex worker, so it can't be YA. And I was like, but you can shoot somebody in the face in YA. Like, I don't understand like why the struggles of what a lot of actual teenagers live with are not fodder for YA, but brutal murder is. And so it's that's a genre convention certainly that bothers me a little bit. So yeah, for sure. Tade, what have you got for us?
I think it would have to be Far From the Light of Heaven, which on the face of it looks like a space opera. It's a colony ship, if you will. It's got 1,000 passengers going from Earth to a colonized planet. And if you look at it that way, you can say, yes, it's a space opera. However, it isn't. So what I did was to write a locked room mystery. In other words, there's murder, and there is, and we're in a locked environment, i.e. a spacecraft, and we have to figure out who did the murders, because there were quite a few of them, and obviously the murderer and the victims and the people, investigating are all in that closed environment, which is basically what you have to have for your locked room mystery. But even in the some of the conventions that I broke, for example, even in the idea of a space crew, I did not draw from my vast experience of reading and watching space operas or space shows or anything like that. What I did instead is to read actual narratives from astronauts, watch hundreds of hours of the International Space Station, look at actual telemetry of trips to the moon and all of that, and and kind of read up space psychology and diseases and all of that occur, and the things that they think will happen in interstellar space travel and all of that. And one of the things that I realized, okay, astronauts are pretty cool. Okay, they're trained not because they as individuals, although they may be exceptional people individually, but they are trained so well. Like even in Apollo 13, their pulses, even when they had no idea how they were getting to Earth, their pulses didn't actually alter. Like, here was a situation where, okay, you know what? Not anything could happen at this point. We may crash and burn. We may just skim off the surface of the atmosphere of the Earth and pummel off into space. Anything can happen. We're about to die. Pulses are all nice and serene, right? So I made that, I gave, and I had to argue with my editor about it, but I'm like, look, she's an astronaut. She's undergone training that, the Apollo teams went through. She's been selected specially for these kind of qualities. So she is not going to panic. She's going to acknowledge the danger, but she is not going to panic because that's not what astronauts do. They start to then cycle through a certain number of things. By team, usually you get a crisis and everybody's like all hands on deck and everything like that. My guys were having sleep cycles because you have to have sleep cycles, otherwise you make more mistakes. Not getting your sleep, whether there's a crisis or not, is more dangerous than anything else. So I made sure that they had sleep cycles. I made sure that, because again, boredom is a problem for astronauts, especially on a long trip. So I made them have work schedules and all of that stuff, which usually you don't see them as part of space opera. There were no space battles or anything like that, because I really think space battles are impractical, even though we've seen it several times. But one of the things I can't, for example, imagine is an astronaut who's gone through astronaut training, well, at least what I saw of astronaut training, deliberately causing another astronaut in another spaceship harm. It's very difficult to imagine if you look at the training that they have. It's very difficult to imagine, even if they are on different ideological sides. It's very difficult to imagine. So I didn't have space battles. And all of this caused a really long conversation between myself and my editor and my agent. Like, well, are we going to market this as a space opera? I'm like, I don't, and again, I don't really care much about classifications in that sense. I said, look, it's a murder in a locked room, or rather, it's 35 murders in a locked room. That's the thing. And there was no, I'm not going to say what the ending is, but it's not a space opera ending at all. It's not a space opera ending. We find out how the murder was done. In fact, actually, the entire narrative is based on an Edgar Allan Poe story, Murder in the Rue Morgue. It's actually based on that. Even the solution of the murder is based on the solution in that short story as well. So it's not really, it doesn't really end like a space opera should.
That's really interesting. I mean, my first thought was not Edgar Allan Poe. It was, I think, Murder on the Orient Express or something like that. Very similar idea of a moving object that's locked up and people can't get on and off. But as a pilot, I absolutely love what you're saying, because you don't panic when something goes wrong. You go through a checklist, and that's what you do. You go through a checklist. And if you're the kind of person who panics, you shouldn't be in command of an airplane, because something will go wrong and it will be dangerous. And you have a checklist for that, and you follow the checklist into the ground, and that's what you do. And so I think it's one of those. Yeah, well, but all those Apollo astronauts were former military test pilots, and so if you can imagine not just flying a plane, but flying experimental planes in an age where they had much less computer modeling, and so they could have radical instabilities in the aircraft while you're going Mach 1 over the desert. Like, you don't know what's going to happen. So you have to be a very particular kind of person to be chosen for that position. And it's not somebody who panics. It's somebody who can follow their checklist. So yeah, that's interesting. I really appreciate
recommendation. Like there's a film called Sunshine, all right, about this spacecraft that goes near the sun. And there's a particular scene in that film where they all know there's a problem, and they say, okay, we need to figure out what to do here. And the captain says, okay, fine, we'll vote. And then one of them says, we're not going to vote. We're the most intelligent minds gathered together for this thing. We are going to figure it out according to our expertise. All right. We're not voting. All right. And that, that has always kind of stuck with me. Like, well, yeah, why are they voting? People have different expertise. Why, for example, is a botanist going to vote with someone who has no experience in botany about a botanical problem? You don't vote. You go to whoever knows about it, who will then say this is what we should do. So there, and it harkens to something someone else pointed out. Like, look, people should know their jobs.
Yeah, exactly. People should know their jobs. Chris, so which of your books have you picked for us?
Well, I'll say something about stringers. But real quick, backing off of what Tade said, I actually think the idea of panic as a reaction to something is overdone even amongst lay people, and I'm learning that in real time. So I'm revising before I turn in my horror novel, and as I do it, I'm going through and I'm going, you have a lot of times where the crazy thing happens, and your main character, feels a well of panic or bile in her throat or whatever, and it gets really old. And there's a point where people don't react like that anymore, and they do sort of become, at least, I don't even know if it's desensitized or whatever, but they do behave differently, less emotionally, even lay people in a traumatic situation, because I think there's only so many times, there's only so much panic you can have and so much panic reaction. Eventually, I think it sort of evens out. So I'm dealing with that right now, trying to get that balance right. But as for where I felt like I sort of broke a convention in Stringers, there's a character, and I really enjoyed doing this. There's a character that tells you from the first time you meet them that they are a bad person, what they're going to do. From the second they meet them, and every moment they tell you, they make it very clear, when I have the chance to do this, I'm going to do this bad thing. And then when they do it, you're surprised. I've had several people say, oh my God, this was so obviously a redemption setup, that this person was not going to do the bad thing, and then they do it. And that was super fun, because what I realized, it was kind of a happy accident. What I realized is that you can tell the reader exactly what you're going to do and still surprise them when you do it. And that was a cool discovery for me, because again, I've been writing for like 8 years, which is not that long. And so I learn so much every time I write. And I kind of discovered that by accident, that usually you're looking for the switch, you're looking for an arc. Well, this person didn't have an arc. This person was, and again, I think arcs are overrated, to be totally honest. I don't think that, thank you. I don't think that everybody has an arc over a period of whatever months or a few years or even decades necessarily. Some people just are the way they are. And sometimes you discover who they were because of the circumstances they are then put in, and you never knew who they were. And so the arc is really the circumstances, not the person. But I liked being able to show that as an example, that, look, this person was exactly who they said they were. They did not change. Some people do not change. And so that was a fun sort of accidental thing that I stumbled upon, I saw it, and then I fleshed it out.
I love that. I had a similar situation, actually. I had a character who he's not the antagonist of my first book. He's actually kind of like kind of like an ally to the main character, but he's just the worst guy. And everybody thought that I was giving him some kind of redemption arc. And book 2 is about how, no, he is the worst guy, and he's still the worst guy, and he's always going to be the worst guy. And just because he was politically convenient in book 1 doesn't mean he's not a terrible person, right? He's just still a terrible person. And so I thought that was an interesting one to go with, because I had some readers say like, oh, I don't like that this guy got a redemption arc. I was like, you think that's a redemption arc? Like, he's still terrible, but like, there's nothing changed about this guy. Like, I don't understand.
If you want to write realistic stuff, more often than not, people don't change.
I mean, that's my experience, reason, right?
Right. That's my experience. Maybe that's a little bit misanthropic, but that's kind of where I come from.
Or at least I find that people
generally
change.
don't change. People generally don't change. Generally, they don't change. Some of them, you may make some changes in some specific things. A lot of people even drift back to who they were before, before that. But generally speaking, character arcs are completely artificial. They're constructs. They're fictional constructs.
Interesting. That's actually a really good question. Maybe we'll loop back to that, because I don't know. I do think people change, but I think that the change is not always the change we want, and it's not always. But I think it's always there. Like, I think it's like the thing that they changed to was in them to begin with, and I think that's the trick with some story arcs, is that you see somebody changing to something radically different, and you're like, that was never in that person. That person's not going to make that change. So I think, I think maybe it depends. But Hannah, what have you got for us from your books?
Now I'm thinking about, have I changed? What is my life? I'm in a whole... Wow. Okay, so I went and I got, this is the arc of my one that's going to come out. So pretty. Oh, The Thick and the Lean is a classic, like, taboo switch. It's a culture where sex is public, food pleasure, taboo, hidden, private. So I feel like the taboo switch is very, like, you can see that in many different genre books and TV shows. And I felt like, as I really followed this premise, like, I thought that I was going to write maybe like a pithy short story or maybe a novella, but I kept following it through, like, what are their church services like? What kinds of art and reality TV gets made in this culture? What is the underground restaurant, black markets like? What are, like, different subcultures and oppressed cultures that are trying to, like, resist this approach? As I really, like, dug through all of that, I think the genre convention that I'm bending is that it is a dystopia, but I think that there's some things about it that are quite positive. So I don't think it's a black and white dystopia. If I could cherry pick some parts of the culture and bring them into our reality, I think that would be kind of cool. But yeah, I'm less going on what Chris and what Tade has said too. I do follow and care about, like, morally gray and complex people, but I'm not someone that's typically going to write a, like, evil character. And I think that the most socially and politically charged structures are things that at least some people think that there's some positives. So, there's people in this book that will really lobby for keeping the power structure in place. And I don't think that's because they're necessarily bad. It's that they really think that that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. I also am a little tired of monoliths. So
Yeah.
monolithic dystopias don't really interest me that much. And I love a bad guy who has, like, whether they're moral or amoral, they have an agenda that's understandable and intelligible, and that you could see their point of view. I think that's always fun as in an antagonist. So I think that's really cool. Vaishnavi, what have we got with you? What did you bend and break in your if any, in your writing?
Yeah, so my debut novel was, like I said, somewhere between historical fiction and fantasy, and I think it was breaking conventions in a way because the elements that you would think of as being fantasy elements weren't fantasy elements and weren't being treated as such, and that would be like the existence of gods and demons and all of that, because this is a religious text of a religion that's still practiced today. I have no idea what's happening with the lighting on my face, and I am so sorry. I just like
The sun's moving.
realize that the sun has moved into a terrible spot. But the epic is believed to be a historical text by many people. That's the religion I was raised in, and so the gods and demons part is like very sort of matter of fact. It's like there, it's part of life, and that to me is not fantasy. And then there's one small fantasy element where the main character has like a small amount of magic that's available to her, sort of beyond the scope of gods and demons. And I think it was really I think like a reader split with whether they were thinking that like the gods and demons part was fantasy and therefore wanting more from it and wanting more, huge displays of power or like big conflict between the gods and the demons and things like that you're sort of set up to expect when you have a world where there's demonic forces and god forces. And that's not like what happens, because it's a religion, and like it's treating it like it's an actual practiced religion, which it is, and like treating it with the respect that it should therefore receive. And so the main character's journey is influenced sometimes by the gods and the demons with which she interacts, but in the end it's just about like humans and the terrible things that they do to each other, and there is no final battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, which is sort of what I think some people expect when they meet the god characters and the demon characters and all of that.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and it's a different set of expectations, both from like a fantasy genre standpoint, but also from a sort of a religious text standpoint. I mean, my friend did a retelling about the Iliad recently, and having the gods be actual physical characters who are there with plots and ideas of their own, like, is such an alien worldview to a lot of modern readers, and so it's an interesting, especially modern Western readers. So it's an interesting one.
I agree, and I think the idea that like there are multiple gods with like some things that we cannot understand and some human elements is like very foreign and in some ways taboo. But then like if you've grown up in this religion, that's like all you know. And to me, like the idea of there being one god that is like unknowable is like confusing and odd. So it's all about, I think, like what your cultural background is to some extent.
No, I totally agree, and I think I certainly experienced that with just talking about some of my experiences living in India, where someone would have Ganesh, and at the same time they would have Jesus on the same altar, and people raised in Western Christianity are like, you can't do that, and I'm like, yeah, you absolutely can, and she's doing it, and there's not really a lot you can do about it. So there it is. So yeah, it's so definitely I think that makes your approach to the genre conventions a really interesting and worthwhile one. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. We're getting on a little bit past an hour now, so we'll do one more question. And the one that I want to ask is, pick a book that you've written, story that you've written, and I want you to tell me, and maybe the same one, that might make it really interesting. I want to know, we're talking about the genre conventions that we bent or broke. Which ones did you keep and why? Which genre conventions were the ones that you kept? You said, you know what? I'm rolling with this. I like it. I think it's good. And maybe it's why you picked the genre that you write in a little bit too, to some degree, I think probably. So Dan, you want to start us off with that? I know I gave you like zero warning for that question, but
That's okay.
I'll
I'm
ambush
ready.
you.
So genre conventions I kept, first of all, you probably can't see all of it because I'm in the way, but swords and dragons. So I actually have a couple of books that are sword-free fantasy, but I was like, I want to come back to old school. So I was like, there's got to be, swords have to be important because the last 2 books had no swords in them. And I want to do one again because I hadn't done one in a while. And then when you see the cover, you can see those things on there. And also, I wanted to harken back a little to classic thing. My brother and I have this thing we call the big stupid. So in an action book or movie or show, there's usually a point at which there's a big battle of some kind, which we call the big stupid, because oftentimes it follows certain conventions. You're expecting an epic showdown between the villains and the heroes, at a certain point in the book. So I was like, I definitely want to work to a big stupid, but hopefully make it be a little bit less stupid, if you will. So I don't know whether I succeeded, but those are definitely swords, dragons, and a big stupid. And also, since we're talking about fantasy, I wanted to go all in. I have a tendency to be a little bit minimalist about the fantasy elements, particularly about magic, and leave it a little bit vague and kind of like a little bit invisible. But I wanted the magic, because I just wanted to mix it up. I wanted the magic to be kind of in your face and sort of showy compared to the past. So like there's one character that has like a magical gauntlet that has a limited number of spells that they can use. And it's all very visible and everyone can see what's happening. And then there's another, other characters that have spells that are much more sort of visible. So anyway, I wanted to keep that, classic. So if somebody is into like D&D or role-playing games or classic fantasy, I want them to find those things in the book, because after all, that's why we read, is to be entertained. But I also wanted to, do something different. So by keeping classic fantasy elements like dragons, swords, fighting, magic, etc., and bringing in some other stuff, my hope is that maybe some readers who don't normally read, smutty books will be like, hey, this kind of works. I kind of like this. Or maybe, some people will tolerate it and just skip over the smut, and that's okay. But I wanted to get back to my fantasy roots. I think I did.
Awesome. That sounds really fun. And certainly those are swords and dragons. I kind of have I hate dragons. And so I tried to make myself like them for my novels by making them not dragons. I was like, they have to be aerodynamically plausible. And then I was like, well, let me calculate the wing loading of these animals to make sure that it works out. So so I'm with you there.
Just to be clear, these dragons don't fly. They're really they're just big beasts. So I have dragons in the Maer Cycle that are feathered, and this dragon, they're just giant lizards, maybe a little bit smarter than a lizard, but they're not magical. They don't know anything like that.
Oh, sweet. We're going back to serious fantasy roots. We're going back to, the hardcore stuff. That's great. I love that.
Yes.
Tate, how about you? What have you got for us that you kept in genre conventions?
Okay, so in my Rosewater trilogy, so I got Rosewater Insurrection, and Rosewater Redemption. At its core, it's an alien invasion story. It's a very slow alien invasion story, but it still is that. So there's certain things that I think Hannah mentioned these earlier, but there's certain things that I expected, like a confrontation with the aliens is expected. And there's certain things, I basically put a war in there, although the war wasn't between the humans and the aliens, it was between humans and humans who had different ideas of what should be done with the aliens. So in Insurrection, there's a war, and it's about a disagreement. It's about a social disagreement about, the changes that the aliens have brought upon society and whose point of view should prevail. But there's a war in there, so that's a trope. And in the third book, there is the human versus aliens thing, although I did not deliver it in the traditional way. And I also made it self-aware, because a character actually says, all right, humans versus aliens, we're on. I wanted to make sure that readers knew that I know what you're expecting around this time in the third book of a trilogy of an alien invasion, but that's not what we're going to do. so I did it, although I did it in a different way that, than probably would have been expected. There again, here's my alien invasion story, and there aren't any spaceships at all. I mean, there is one space station, but it's only mentioned in passing, and we never see it. So and yet it still is an alien invasion narrative. So that the idea of a confrontation, the idea that, okay, look, humans and aliens have to have a confrontation, that happened, just not in the same way. But I felt like, okay, look, it's an invasion. People expect something to happen. I mean, everybody's been conditioned by World War I and World War II to think that, okay, look, if people invade you, you're going to repel them in some way or the other. It's a kind of narrative in people's, it's in the communal memory that, okay, look, invasion means they have to be repelled at some point. It may take decades to repel them, but you will repel them one way or the other at some point. So yeah, that's what I did. That's my alien invasion story.
Awesome. Yeah, I love an alien invasion story going back to War of the Worlds, which is probably the most conventional of them at this point, because it kind of set the mold. Yeah, absolutely. Chris, what have you got for us?
Well, so in my book Stringers, it's my humorous space opera. I kept the trope of faster than light travel because you have to. That if you're going to do anything outside the solar system or really inside the solar system, I mean, the Expanse had the Epstein drive, which isn't faster than light, but it was sort of a hand wave. We have this drive and it can go really fast. I had a much larger area I had to cover, so I had to come up with a faster than light or instantaneous travel device. And I actually made it part of the story that one of the characters has these voices in her head that are telling her how to make it. And of course, you learn why she's got the voices in her head and all of that later. But I spent probably 3 months watching YouTube videos on entangled particles and just trying to come up with something plausible that hadn't been done before, right? For faster than light travel. And ultimately, I came up with something that this character designs called a switch drive, and where you disappear in one place and instantly come up somewhere else. But I had to create a whole new type of matter to do it. Everything's matter these days. If you just read a scientific article, it's all matter. And so I kind of take things that I read in like Scientific American or like Quanta and those things. I'm like, well, that's interesting. Now I'm going to take that and I'm going to bend it into something that's not real, but it's still, like that. So I had to, out of necessity, I had a big expanse I had to get across in human scales of time. And so the thing I kept was this faster than light travel, but I tried to twist it enough so it still felt new. It felt original, even though it's not.
Yeah, no, I actually I have a book that has a very similar quantum entanglement method of travel. So we can both be original together.
Right.
No, but I mean, there's limited ways to sort of, your brain wants plausible, and you're like, let's be plausible, and then you look at it and you're like, man, the more I learn about astrophysics, the more I don't want to ever read any space thing ever again, because it makes me feel really alone. And I realize that there's probably millions of alien species I would love to meet and talk to and hang out with. Like, that's my dream job as cultural xenologist. And I realize that like they're all alone on their little planets and they can't get to us either. And the universe is just expanding and making us get farther away from each other. And that we're all going to just like never meet. And that's just really sad. So I feel you on needing some FTL.
Well,
what?
We could meet them, but we may not be able to perceive each other. Our senses might not be able to perceive.
That's true too.
them,
True too.
Well, the in this one, the matter that I created was the raw matter of consciousness. So basically, it's ubiquitous. It's basically what we think of as dark matter, but it's consciousness. So the way the drive works is you think it into existence. You think the jump into existence. And there's more to it than that, but I was like, it's all matter, so why can't consciousness be matter? So that's where we are.
Sweet. All right. Chana, what did you keep in one of your books that's a genre convention that you liked?
So in the new book, which comes out this spring as a plug, so it's 2 braided plots, and these 2 women are connected by they both find this mysterious 1,000-year-old cookbook. And the cookbook is a memoir, too. So the cookbook has a lot of romance tropes because it's about a kitchen maid in a castle. And I don't want to spoil, but it was very fun for me to write this book within the book and get to explore some of the more traditional court intrigue, romancy tropes.
Yeah, those are super fun. Those are some of my absolute favorite tropes. I love those. Those are.
Your book has a killer cover too, by the way.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to say too that I'm pretty sure that I'm from another planet, so you might get to meet other aliens.
I might get to meet aliens after. Oh,
yeah,
my heart.
maybe
You know.
in today.
Yeah, I mean, you never
Yeah.
know. You never know what might come up, but yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for that. And Vaishnavi, you wanna end us here with our with this question and let us know what you kept for your book.
Well, I feel like my answer is like much more boring than everybody else's. But it's like, to me, it's an oldie but goodie. Kaikeyi opens with the like trope that I love of sheltered princess wants to learn sword fighting. I don't know. This is like a trope that I have always adored.
Jonah Akbar, it up.
I probably like Robin McKinley's fault a little bit. But like, I love this trope. And so the first like of the 4 acts of the book is kind of like sheltered princess learns arts of war, which I love and put in there just honestly for my own gratification. Like, it could have been a lot shorter, but I was like, instead of a training montage, you probably need like many chapters to become even moderately proficient at any of this, and that's what we do. So that's something that got kept in.
That's a great. No, I actually love that trope. In my book, Stealing Thunder, I have basically a trans woman who was like the crown prince of an empire that's based loosely on the Mughals, and so she knows all the arts of war already because she was raised with them, and then was like, "Nah, I'm out of here. I'm going to go be myself." And so later on, it comes up where she's just like, "No, you should do this," and they're like, "Well, how do you know that?" And she's like, "Well, previous life." So I think that's I think the princess who knows the arts of war is a trope that I absolutely adore. So I'll keep that in all of my books, I think, in the future. So that's awesome. Okay, so we have just a couple minutes left. And I think to end, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let us all sell our books. We have like a couple seconds. We're going to go around real quick. We're going to have take a second if you need to click the camera off to get a copy of the book, to sell it. Okay, get your best pitch ready. Tell everybody how excited they should be to read these books because they're all fantastic books. And I'm going to sell my books. Why not? I've got Stealing Thunder here. Oh, no. Yeah, Stealing Thunder by my face. And I've got Gifting Fire over here, which are my 2 novels that are fantastic fantasy novels set in a fantasy Mughal empire. And they follow the adventures of Razia, who's a trans woman member of the royal family. And so I thought that was a fun way to bend and break some major genre tropes by doing that. So I think those ones are really fun. I hope everybody picks them up. And Dan, you're up. I know you've got a background. I was not that that prepared, but go for it.
Well, I think I've already done a pretty good job of selling the Delve. That's the cover by Luke Tarzian, which is great. However, there's the exact opposite of that book I would also like to mention. So this is called, I got to turn off my background to do this. It's called The Living Waters. And let me turn that background off. There we go. The Living Waters, which is a sword-free fantasy book. So it's like painted face nobles on a muddy river, voyage of discovery. And then the follow-up, which is also sword-free and very smutty, called The Isle of a Thousand Worlds. So those are available now. The Delve doesn't come out until Wednesday. So yeah, that's me.
Well, good luck on that debut. That's really exciting, and I hope
Thank
everybody
you.
goes and picks up the Delve. Tade, you've come back. Have you got one for us, or a couple even? Don't worry, I won't limit you. You're muted.
Your mic's not on.
Uh oh, we're muted still.
Your
Tade.
mic is
We're
off.
muted.
Your mic.
There we go.
Okay, so the book I've been talking about tonight, Far from the Light of Heaven. It's a murder mystery in space. Have a look at it. It's really good. This is The Murders of Molly Southbourne. It's basically a woman who bleeds, and she makes clones of herself from the bleeding, and those clones want to kill her immediately as soon as they grow. My latest book is Jackdaw. It's a horror novella. It's very thin, but it's very, very disturbing. So I'm going to apologize in advance for those of you who get disturbed by it. And last but not least, here's Rosewater. Very pretty book, also very good book. It's a trilogy. There's Rosewater Insurrection and there's Rosewater Redemption. Alien Invasion as you've never seen it. That's it.
Wow, look at those covers though. Those are some cool
They're
covers.
really good. I love the covers. They're really pretty, and they're actually one large illustration. If you put them together, they make one picture.
Wow, that's
I can't do it here, but they're all one picture. It's really good.
That's amazing. That's really cool. So everybody should buy all three of those so that they can have the picture. Otherwise, what's the point? Chris, what have you got for us to sell?
Okay, well, I mean, my books can be used to land aircraft at night. The Stringers is funny in outer space and with some hard sci-fi elements. It is not Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy at all, but is also but I think fans of that would probably like this. That came out this year, and then in 2020, The Phlebotomist came out. This is near future sci-fi starring two sexagenarian women. One of whom is a grandmother who wears a pink wig so her grandson can always find her. So they're both sci-fi. This is dystopian. And then next year, my debut horror will be released called The Redemption of Morgan Bright, which is about a woman whose sister died in an asylum, and so the living sister has herself committed to find out what happened.
That sounds exciting. And it's a great title too. I like the title. Yeah, absolutely. Chana, what have you got for us?
Here's my debut. Benevolent but paradigm shifting alien invasion. That's really about exploring grief. Here it is in Turkish for anyone who reads Turkish. Didn't they do a good job at that?
A little bit, yeah. Cover? That's great.
And then here is the new one. Comes out this spring. I feel like I've said a lot about it.
Yeah, but it's food, and everybody loves food.
Food and sex. So,
Yeah, that's exciting. Well, everybody, I hope goes and picks those up, especially the new debut. That's going to be really great. I'm looking forward to that one as well. And then Vaishnavi, would you like to share yours?
Sure. I only have one book out, and that is Kaikeyi. It comes out in paperback very soon. I'm a paperback reader, so that's why I mentioned that. And it is a myth retelling of the Ramayana from the perspective of sort of the evil stepmother character. Like, that's an oversimplification of her role, but it is a retelling from her perspective.
Yeah, I think that was a really cool idea, and I love that cover. Is the paperback going to have the same cover?
Yeah, so the paperback is going to have the same cover, and it will have the foil, which is like my favorite part of the cover. But I don't think it'll have deckled edges, which I've heard are controversial.
Really?
Yeah, like apparently some people really hate it. So
interesting. Huh. Well, I think it's a gorgeous cover. I love it, and I hope everybody goes and picks it up. It's been getting a lot of buzz, at least in the circles that I run in. So, so congratulations. That's a great debut. Okay, I think that's all we have for today. I just want to thank all of you for spending your Saturday a little bit with me here from all of your various time zones, and for putting together a great talk on bending and breaking genre conventions. So thank you all so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alina.
Thank you.
Absolutely.